You're like someone who I really respect talking to and who's actually taught me like way more than I've ever learned from probably anyone else about this. But I don't want Israel to become a Jewish state. But weren't Arabs also colonized during that? It's settlements though, Palestinian settlements.
What are you talking about?
Honestly, like I don't know all of the nuances for the details of that part.
If you argue about
like,
this, it's very important. Tell me why you disagree with this, and then I'll give you my take and we can have a conversation.
So it's not that I necessarily disagree with that, it's just that if you think that that statement justifies the colonization of Palestine, then I like fundamentally disagree with that, because it doesn't.
So you know that the creation of Israel was the decolonization of the land, because the British were the force before, and the Jews revived their civilization, kicking out the British. The Romans called it Palestine as an act of colonization, right? This was 2,000 years ago. Islam was born 1,500
So that's like how racial formations evolved, though. Do you know what I mean?
I'm talking about today there's a group
like
of people.
when you say that the Ottoman Empire called the Arabians Palestinians.
No, they didn't.
No, they called that land Palestine.
The Romans, when they destroyed the Jewish civilization, they renamed the land Palestine.
Yeah.
Okay, why did they do this? Because there was an ancient nation called the Philistines that existed from Greece that was one of the biggest enemies of the Jewish people, and as an insult, they renamed our land by one of our former greatest enemies. It's as if a country today were to conquer Israel, God forbid, and rename it Hitler. So they named the land Palestine. This was 1,000 years before Arabs even landed in the land of Israel.
It's like it's interesting though that it's like when you set this up, it seems like as if you were claiming that the minority of Jewish people that reside in Palestine
Today, minority women?
They're not now.
Oh, they are definitely
not now.
They weren't before.
But they were.
No, before they were the majority until they were kicked out.
You're talking about all the way before to the Ottoman Empire?
To before the Romans destroyed our civilization. Why do we get to choose? Which was 2,000 years ago. And since then, no. Roman, Byzantine, Arabs, Ottoman, and then today Israel.
Well, so Ottoman's British, then Israel.
As a same land.
No, so it's one civilization and then a land controlled by an empire.
Yeah.
It was never a state between Judea and until Israel. It was just a land controlled by an empire.
Honestly, like, I don't know all of the nuances for the details of that.
If you argue about this, it's very important.
Because it's still arguing for, like, don't get me wrong, I don't think that the Jewish people should have been colonized by the Romans. Like, I do not think that. Do you know what I mean? I don't think that the Native Americans should have been colonized by the Dutch, English, you know what I mean?
Agreed.
It's like, however, because Palestinians evolved to be like the ethnic group that was dominating that specific area.
They never dominated that area. It was the British that dominated.
But they did, though.
No, it was the British.
I don't agree that Israel has the right to take over Palestine.
No, but there was never a Palestinian state. It was the British Empire controlling the land of the Jews.
It's settlements, though. Palestinian settlements.
What are you talking about, Palestinian settlements? I think that Palestinians, any individual living in the land of Israel, deserves full equal human rights. Palestinians to me are my cousins. I'm Israel.
Yeah.
Okay? So what I believe, that why we're saying that Jews are indigenous to Israel, is because when we're talking about indigeneity, we're talking about a collective history and a connection to a land.
Yeah.
The Jewish people are the first nation on the land. When you dig in the land, you find Jewish artifacts. There was never a Palestinian state, country, civilization.
So there actually was the Palestinian state.
When? They started.
Like,
when was the Palestinian state? Who was their leader?
It was never legitimized or recognized.
But when were they?
It's like,
when
that
did
is still an ethnic group.
There was the British, the Ottomans, the Byzantines, the Romans. It was always a piece of land controlled by a foreign empire.
If Arabians were placed into Palestine,
they weren't placed. They violently conquered the land.
Who was owning it before?
The Byzantine Empire before.
The Byzantine.
And before the Byzantine Empire was the Roman Empire. Before the Roman Empire was the Jews.
So how does you, as someone who's arguing for Israel as a holy site for contemporary Jewish people?
I'm not talking about holy site or contemporary. I'm talking about the fact
that is what Israel is.
The Jewish people are the native people of that land, and they revived their civilization after decolonizing that land from the British.
But that's actually actually like not what's going on. Because if Israel...
So right now there's an ethnic conflict between two populations. So they definitely are currently suffering because of a status quo that exists that I'm against, where Israelis are suffering as well. I've lost many friends. I have many Palestinians that are my friends that have died as well. And there's a way to solve that with fulfilling the aspirations of both and ending the injustices.
So how would you fulfill the aspirations of both though? Because the Zionists, that like statements like this kind of seem similar to, like, obviously I know that by you saying that, it's not saying like, oh, I'm a Zionist and I believe that.
Well, what do you define as Zionism?
Zionism?
People define it differently.
I mean, probably
what is
like
a Zionist, for example?
Someone who sees religion and feels like that religion gives them some entitlement.
So Zionism was a secular Jewish movement that Muslims didn't believe in God at all. So if that was Zionism, I wouldn't support that. For me, what I consider
Zionism is like an economic movement.
There's many different branches of Zionism. There's liberal Zionism.
What would you consider?
Okay, so Zionism is a self-determination of the Jewish people on their ancestral homeland. And anyone who believes that the Jews have a right to live there is a Zionist. That's what I consider, that's actually the definition of Zionism in the textbook, and what Zionists define it as. Then, there's another layer. If you yourself are already a Zionist, and you also have a religious background, or agenda, or a left background, or a right background, then you're a Zionist that believes in this. But Zionism as a concept is the right for the Jewish people to self-determine on their homeland.
If Zionism is all about indigenous rights, though, then what does it mean to be a Christian Zionist?
Christian Zionists are people that believe that Jews have a right to live in the homeland, but from a Christian perspective. Now, that can mean many things. It can mean evangelical.
So Zionism is always about Jews?
Zionism is about the Jewish people having a right to self-determine in their ancestral land.
Okay.
Having nothing to do with the conflict, having nothing to do with what background you have, just the idea that you believe that Jews have a right to live there. Now, when it comes to Christian Zionism, there's a lot of evangelical stuff, like all the Jews have to come to Israel so that Jesus can come back. All that stuff is like, for me, nonsense. But when it comes to Zionism as a root word, the reason I identify as a Zionist is because I identify as the definition that I gave you. If you define it as by something else, then I would reject it.
So if you're saying that, like, your opinion is that Jewish people have the right to live in Israel, which, like, I totally agree with, but I don't want Israel to become a Jewish state that seeks to literally murder Palestinians. Like, that's the issue. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, so I'm against the murder of any population, especially my cousins, the Palestinians.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that that's what is happening in Israel.
And I feel that. It's just, like, for what you're putting against, it's like, don't get me wrong, this is something that definitely was a problem and I'm sure has influenced anti-Semitism throughout history. Anti-Semitism is also really closely intermingled with like communism or McCarthyism, the Bolshevist fear. But
it's from the right to the left. The far right sees the Jews as like the communists, and the far left sees the Jews as the capitalists. Any like extreme polarized group sees the problem as the Jews.
Why should the United States? Why should we spend
I'm against
billions.
U.S. foreign aid to Israel.
Okay.
You know why?
Yeah.
Because it forces Israel to be dependent on America and allows America to control foreign policy there.
Well,
and I
not
think
only
it's a big
that.
reason why Israelis and Palestinians can't find a solution together, because it's in the interest of everyone else that we fight each other and America sells weapons to us.
Well, it's like not only that, but it turns Israel into a colonial power.
Well, it turns Israel to be supported by
colonial power.
Well, how is it a colonial power?
Because they are taking over a land that is owned by others. They are colonizing and settlements.
So you can't colonize your own homeland, right? If it's your indigenous land, you can't colonize.
But it's not the Jewish people who are going to Israel are not just Jewish people who have ancestry in Israel.
It is.
It's not,
It
though.
is. Every Jew is historically, genetically, and culturally connected to the Jewish
Every
people.
single Jewish
Yes. Now there are some people that converted, but that's a
Right.
very small minority. But when you convert in our culture, you join a collective, and it's that collective that is indigenous. But if you're talking about,
But it's like that's the words that you want to put on it. That's not actually the name of indigenous. Indigenous is if you're an indigenous American, for example, you're a Native American, you're Mexico,
and that's the same thing of a Jew to Judea. Like, to be indigenous is three things. Your identity and way of life was born and rooted to a piece of land. 2, you've maintained a constant presence on that land. And 3, your collective self-identifies as indigenous.
But the Jewish connection to Israel was politicized after
No, it was
1940s.
actualized. It was revived. That's like the decolonization movement. It's the one movement in history where the indigenous people actually decolonized their land, revived their civilization, revived their language, and kicked out the British. Mm-hmm. And there was another population that existed there, and because the Arab world was against the creation of Israel because they hated the Jews at that time, okay, not everyone, but definitely the leaders, then they kind of used and politicized the local Arab people and now created the rivalry between them. And so many people are profiting from that. Yeah. And the reality that I believe in is a reality where it is a Jewish state, the same way Tibet should be a Tibetan state, the same way Aboriginals should should have rights to the land, same way Native Americans should have rights to the land, with the ability to other people living there be an equal part of the civilization.
See, and I'm like down with that. Like I would love like for people to just all be cooperative and get along. But the fact is that's not what's happening.
Right.
Like as Jewish immigration to Israel increases, Palestinian settlements shrink.
That's not true.
Dude.
That's not true.
You can look at it on
all those
map.
maps that you have is the consequence of wars that happened, where cities were destroyed on both sides.
Between not only like terrorists that reside in the area, but also between Israel, between Palestine.
Look, any illegal territory that's built, whether Jewish or Palestinian, gets removed. Any illegal territory is allowed. And if you're talking about cities, okay, this map is completely false. In 1946, the entire Jordan was a part of the British Mandate of Palestine.
Yeah.
This was under the British, not under any Palestinian. So this map is already false. And then 1947, also this wasn't split. This was the UN partition plan, but this was never approved. 1940, what does it say? This map is false.
I want to believe you. It's just everything else that I've seen does not say that.
May I interject something
this is
about
why,
the indigenous?
Sure.
Hebrews came from Egypt. And
no, they didn't. They left. And
I know.
Okay,
that's what I thought.
So
I thought that the Hebrews originated in Egypt.
No.
As well.
We left. We had a period in Egypt where we left. We became slaves, and we came back to the land that we had come from. However, if we're talking about the origins of humankind, then we all came from Africa. I think the birth of cultures and native.
To be moving from place to
I know, that's the thing. That's why it's like, why is this? Why are y'all bringing up this when the conflict now is what's going on to Palestinians?
Because I think a lot of people
because
a lot of people use that conflict as political ammunition to delegitimize our rights to exist there.
So,
and I believe in ending that conflict, and I live in Israel, and I'm an activist to bring Palestinians and Israelis together. I do this on a daily basis.
And I respect that. You're like someone who I really respect talking to, and who's actually taught me like way more than I've ever learned from probably anyone else about this. So I do, like, I really respect that and appreciate that. I do, especially because like I feel like the majority of experiences that I've had with people who are pro-Israel have not been humanitarian. It's been really Zionist. It's been violent.
Well, what Zionist was before I defined it.
Yeah. And
not my definition.
Like, and then also like, was Zionist entitled to Holy Land or entitled to land?
Not Holy Land. I'm not making a religious argument.
Okay,
I'm making a cultural, historical argument.
But I want to say what you say, because it's like there wasn't just Jewish people in Israel.
Yeah, but they're not just Native Americans.
You know,
only the Native Americans.
To bring peace, you have to recognize their aspiration as well as yours.
Absolutely, but they have different aspirations.
We want to recognize your aspiration.
They have different aspirations than we do. They have different aspirations
and
than
so
we do.
let's now, okay, we have aspirations,
yes.
you have aspirations.
And I believe in a future we can create both.
And let's see how we can
Absolutely.
live.
There was probably different parochial tribes of Jewish people. There was probably different parochial tribes of...
There was 12 tribes of one nation.
12 tribes
of one nation. We saw each other as one civilization, one nation, and different tribes had different territories. And there was one tribe, the tribe I'm from, that lived amongst all.
And were you always 12 tribes?
Yes.
Since the beginning?
Yes.
And when did that begin?
It was the 12 children of Jacob.
Jacob?
Yeah. That's like, we're talking about culture. This is like where the culture comes from, the story. I can't prove.
I'm talking about historically.
Okay, so historically we're 12 tribes.
I don't believe in any religion.
Okay, so historically we're 12 tribes. That's a historical fact. I don't know.
Do you know of the dates though?
Yeah, so 2,000 years was when we were destroyed, and we existed there for about 1,500 years.
So, was that the beginning of the Jewish religion?
I wouldn't say it's a religion, I would say it's an identity of a native people. But yeah, the beginning of this identity was around 3,500 to 4,000.
Because see, like, I definitely consider, like, and of course I know you said it wasn't about religion. That's like what I most understand about Judaism, is that it's an Abrahamic religion.
So look, I'll tell you my perspective.
Okay.
I see Judaism as a portable suitcase that the Jewish people created when they were displaced forcefully by the Romans from Judea in order to preserve their identity and pass it down with the aspirations of one day coming back home. Now, why do I not consider it a religion? Because if you're a Christian and you don't believe in Jesus, you're an atheist, not a Christian. And if you're a Jew and you don't believe in God, you're still a Jew.
Culturally, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not. So religion is just a belief system for any people, and the Jews are not just a belief system. Definitely, a belief system is a fundamental part.
And did Judah have the same exact like arbitrary boundaries of Israel?
Judah? You mean Judea?
Yeah, sorry.
So Judea was, we had the 12 tribes, and there was a split amongst the tribes. There were 4, and the rest went on the other side. So it became the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Judea. The Kingdom of Israel eventually leaves and goes into the diaspora.
So now are you all entitled to the Kingdom of Israel and the Kingdom of Judea?
We're talking about the land of Israel of one people.
Yeah.
So Judea, Israel, it's like different names at different times of the same land for the same people. Because eventually the Kingdom of Israel is leaves Israel completely and goes into diaspora.
Judea is now part of the West Bank, is where the Palestinians, that's Judea.
Judea and Samaria, exactly.
And
that's the heartland of
Israel
Judea.
is more the outskirts.
So 2,000 years ago, the Roman colonizes the entire region.
Yeah.
They fight Judea, the Judeans, and they colonize their people and they kick out.
But weren't Arabs also colonized during that?
No, Arabs, 2,000 years ago, Islam was born 1,500 years ago.
Yeah.
So Israel was colonized, Judea was colonized by the Romans 500 years before the birth of Islam, and Arab culture went out of Arabia through the spread of Islam. So this is like more than 500 years before Arabs even spread to any region.
Dude. Honestly, I feel like the Arabs are a little bit entitled to Palestine if it's conquered from the Romans, just because I don't like the Romans.
They didn't call it from the Romans, they called it from the Byzantine.
Byzantine Empire.
They were different, but the Romans is another empire.
Yeah.
And then the British took over.
Exactly. So it was a land controlled by different.
Yeah.
Finally, because of the Holocaust, the Jews managed to garner enough power.
That's what it's all about, is that they want, because Jewish people want a safe haven.
No, because we could have gone somewhere else.
That is a big part of it.
For 2,000 years.
Could you have gone somewhere else?
Have you ever seen a Jewish wedding where they break the glass and they yell Mazel Tov?
Of course, yeah.
Do you know what that represents?
No.
That Jews have been getting married like that for 2,000 years. It represents the destruction of Jerusalem, and that our kids in this wedding will one day come back home and revive it. We pray towards Jerusalem every year during Pesach, during our holiday.
Yeah.
We say next year in Jerusalem. So our entire culture was based on one day returning back home. Now, it is true that the Holocaust galvanized support and allowed Jews to be like, oh, we can't actually live in the diaspora, we're constantly being killed, let's come back home.
Yeah.
But I would say that Israel was not created because of the Holocaust happened because Israel didn't exist.
I don't think the Holocaust happened because Israel didn't exist.
The Holocaust happened because the Jews are constantly a minority that is persecuted and exterminated.
Well, it's look at the pogroms,
yes.
You know what I mean?
If it had Israel, I can guarantee you that would never happen.
But it's why do you guys need to have your own nation? Why can't we just focus on
how would you think saying that to Native Americans? Why do you need to have a right to Standing Rock? Or Tibetans,
so it's
why do you have a right to Tibet?
I understand, because I would say the same thing to them, is it's okay, you have a right to your land, but it's what I have the problem with is that Native Americans because I don't believe borders are arbitrary. Do you know what I mean? And it's I totally get that Jewish people have been targeted, definitely. Do you know what I mean? The pogroms, we were talking about it.
Inquisition, the Black Plague,
yes,
the Holocaust.
So many, historically.
Especially in Western white societies.
Yeah, 100%. But it's I don't know that making the argument that destroying Palestine is necessary.
I don't believe in destroying. There was never a Palestine unit. There was just a territory controlled by the British before Israel.
But it wasn't.
No. I know. I've seen the videos. I know what he stands for, so it's all right. And this is right
As a tool to kind of make us the zero-sum game enemies of each other, and then they're selling weapons to us by this foreign aid and controlling the situation.
So let me ask you about this. What do you think about your members telling Palestinians that they don't have a right to have Palestine?
What do you mean by Palestinians don't have? Palestinians deserve full equal human rights.
What did you say?
I just asked if they wanted to have a dialogue, and they shut me down. They didn't want to talk with me.
They have by the way, this is an exact example of why a lot of Palestinian groups don't actually represent Palestinians, because they have anti-normalization policies. If you truly want to change something for the future, you would realize that there's no future without Palestinians or no future without Israelis. And the only way we create a reality that allows both of us to live in the future is for us to come together. And they're interested to demonize Israel and to speak to everyone else instead to speak to us. Are you willing to engage with me in a conversation?
I've seen your videos, and I'm so surprised you're here. This is such a meme.
You're a meme.
I'm angry anti-Zionist Jew fanboying right now. Confused diaspora Jew, small brain,
then show that you're not
compared to the masculine Rudy Rochman, big arms.